and I was an OS. An ordinary seaman was my classification, and this would be most of my uniform. What I'm minus, because it always gets in the way of my work, is my scarf, or my handkerchief, or what we called it, the scarf. Never the scarf, it was the scarf. That would be even in my way today in this uniform. This is a copy of a uniform that came from the Maritime Museum because I'm a docent there. And so I conduct tours, and sometimes it's in full uniform. So this would be what the uniform would be: the jacket, the vest, the plaid shirt, and the button-up and laced trousers. Okay. All right. I'm going to take part of it off because it's going to just get in my way.
Did you sew your own outfit?
Pardon me?
Did you sew your own outfit?
Did I sew my own outfit? I did not. This would have been produced through the United States and the Navy. This would have been issued. It wouldn't have happened when we first got into Erie. So my name is George Williams. I was a recruit from Buffalo in what we called the U.S. Navy, which was very small. We were recruited with the idea that we would make up to $10 a month plus any reward money or prize money, as it was called. And the way we got that would be if we won a battle and we took possession of ships or property that could be sold, then that allotment would be divided up among those that were in active duty on that ship or in that regiment that would do work to gain that. So here we are. Erie, Pennsylvania was first called Presque Isle. It was not called Erie, Pennsylvania. Back in 1812, there were only less than 500 people that actually lived in the hamlet of Erie. There were only 42 building structures in the proper of Erie. The War of 1812 was decreed and ordered in June of 1812. A merchant by the name of Daniel Dobbins had merchant ships that he would take up the lakes, across up into Michigan, and sell salt, which was the main productive area from the Buffalo, Rochester areas, salt, believe it or not. And he also took whiskey, which was in high demand, and furs. In July of 1812, Dobbins took his ship and his crew and went up to Fort Mackinac, where the British won the battle. The battle was only amongst those that were in the fort. The British came with their ships. The British also came down the line. They made allies with the Indians and tried to stop any development west of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. They didn't want the property, the borderline, to stay up. They wanted to come down in to take advantage of what was in the territories. So that's what was part of the start of the battle and the war. One of those issues, as Daniel Dobbins found out, was as they took over his ship, they took all the merchandise, and they also impressed the crew to be part of the Royal Navy. That was one of the big issues, that they were taking people from the United States and impressing them into their Navy, no longer having citizenship. They were more or less slaves to the Royal Navy and the British government. A number of those incidents caused for them to declare the war. Now, when it went before the Senate and House of Representatives, there was a number of issues. And as they voted, the East Coast states voted against declaring war. They felt that that was a territorial problem, and they didn't feel that they had any power over the British. Now, when the war was still beginning and just at the time of declaration, even though the ships weren't on the Great Lakes, the Royal Navy had over 700 ships. The United States had 17. Big difference. But yet none of them were on the Great Lakes. They couldn't come down in from out on the ocean line and bring them down into it. So any of the ships that needed to be built were built along the Great Lakes, as it was the border between Canada and the United States. Well, when that happened, Daniel Dobbins was taken prisoner. He managed to talk his way out because of his acquaintances within both the British line and the United States line. The man was kind of an international merchant. He was released. He went to Detroit, and he was re-imprisoned because of the takeover of Detroit by the British. He was released from that line and came back to Erie. He realized that because of the war and because of what we had here in Erie, he went to see President Madison and also spoke before the Senate in September of 1812. And he spoke of the idea that this was a perfect place to build the ships because of the peninsula. The peninsula was described as a slip of sand that jutted out away from the mainland. The mainland in Erie had many sloping banks. The peninsula, which blockaded the lake, but also in the harbor, there was a sandbar with only 6 feet of water above it. None of the British ships could come in to the harbor. Now, the Brits thought maybe they would stick themselves in there and we'd go in on land and take them out. They didn't know what the plan was. So, President Madison gave Daniel Dobbins $2,000 and gave him the instructions to build the fleet. $2,000 to build gunboats. Gunboats that would hold maybe 2 to 3 cannons, and also had the militia on there with their rifles. They started building. Now, with only less than 300 people in the territory, in this little hamlet, they had to call for others to come. Come. Get paid. We need shipbuilders. We need carpenters. We need men of valor. We need those that would like to work and defend the United States. So, in that, between the time that that first calling was in 1815, the city grew to 3,000 people. Now, with the influx of people like myself and others, like my buddies and other ones that we would get to know, needed a place to live. Temporary housing. We needed people to build houses and to construct them in a way that they would hold large amounts of men. So, there were some profiteers within the city gaining the cost of boarding, building the house in boarding. We weren't able to buy anything, but we were able to pay a boarding rent when our wages were paid to us as we continued to work. Now, in all that time period, the ships were being built, but there were no supplies here in Erie. So, Daniel Dobbins, along with the shipbuilder Ebenezer Crosby, started ordering the materials needed. They ordered shot, they ordered cannons, they ordered anchors, they ordered rigging, they ordered sailcloth, they ordered a number of things either from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. The timbers came from right here in Erie, because between the hamlet where the buildings were constructed and the lake, there was banks sloping down to the water line. At the base of the banks, there were large areas of timbers. Black oak, white oak, yellow pine, and white pine were the predominant line of timbers, separating the view of the lake and the bay and the city. Those timbers were cut. They had to have axes. They had to have the crossbow saws. They had to have all that. That was not in Erie. They had to send for these materials. They came, but in the time to get there, they had to start figuring out the plans. They had to figure out the layout of the structures. They had to kind of come up with their own design, where the architects of the Navy, of the ships, were designing them and giving them the need for supplies. What was needed? Well, during the winter, the course is not easy to come from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. The roads were rough, the mountains, the weather itself. Some of it came right close, but it took time. It took time. But the war was already declared. There were already areas that were taken over. The British were gaining momentum. They need to find parts. They need to get the materials. When they did come, they had to have the craftsmen to come and start building the line, to start cutting down the wood. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen anyone with an axe cutting through large trees. It's not something that's done that easily. It takes 2 to 3 men per tree. These trees were very large. They were cumbersome. They were large enough that the keel of the flagship was made from one tree. One black oak tree. 14 inches by 18 inches by over 100 feet. That was a large, heavy load. Now, the shipyards, there were 2 of them. There was one at Lee's Run. Lee's Run had quite a big ravine, and it was running down to the lake just west of Sassafras. You're familiar with Sassafras? That's where it was. The other was Chestnut. Chestnut Run was just a few blocks west of there. The ravines were deep. The river, more or less a stream or a brook, was deep enough and the current was strong enough that it was a good spot for them to launch the ships. These were the gunboats at first. Now, those two areas were the first shipyards for the construction of the battle crew. We that were there going to be on the ships were put to work in helping move, helping to get things started, and help unload supplies as they came. We had to do it in an orderly fashion, so we had to have someone in control. Daniel Dobbins was our shipmaster, and he took control of the building of those ships. Well, it got to the point where on New Year's Eve, December 31st of 1812, Commodore Isaac Chauncey came from Ontario to view the ships, to view the ports, to view the shipyards. On his seeing the ships that were in construction, he felt that they were too small and too inadequate for what they would be doing. They would be carrying some cannons, so they needed to be long enough and heavy enough to do that load. That load would have been over a ton in structure. So he had them add on 10 feet onto the ships. They were only 50 foot long by 17 foot wide. At that point, he ordered the two larger gunboats that would carry 20 cannons. The cannons would have been ordered, and they were coming from Washington, D.C. and New Jersey. They were two different types. There was the long gun, which shot 12-pound cannonballs with a distance of almost a mile. They were normally the first shots that would come out to start and get into gear and calibers of how far they had to come to get closer. The shorter cannons, or carronades, were shorter but much heavier and had a larger bore opening that carried 32-pound cannonballs with the range of up to a half a mile. But with that, they had to be on the broadside, so we had 9 on each side and the 2 long guns at the bow. They had to be put in place. They call it a capstan, and what a capstan does, a capstan is a cylinder that has openings in it, and what it does, it turns into the ship, and it turns down. You put your stays in there, or your oars, and you walked around, and it turned, and it pulled the levees, loading the cannons, or lifting the masts. The capstan was a very powerful unit that they used throughout the building. Now, when they started to build the 2 sister ships, they were built at Chestnut. They were built identical. They both had quite a bit of details to them, but yet they were only built for a one-time battle. They were built very quickly. They were built with green, white oak planking. Green, not seasoned. They had to put them up together, and because of the iron shortage, they used their iron to do the straps and the number of essential needs for the boat. But in nailing the planks, they literally used wooden pegs for nails. They were called tree nails. With the tree nails, when they went in and the moisture was there, then they would swell, and then as they dried up, they drew themselves into the wood even more, which made them very secure, but yet they were not made of the metal, the iron that was necessary to keep them in the stronghold. But to their defense afterwards, we'll explain a little bit more of all that detailing. What I will tell you is that in that time period, they were bringing the sails in. The sailcloth came in, and the sailcloth, over 1,000 square yards of sailcloth. That sailcloth had to be sewn into square sails. Square sails were important because of the maneuverability. When the wind came and the riggers would pull on a certain line to line up with the wind, they would be square and the wind resistance would push them in a fuller speed. Square sailing was the way to build brigs and frigates, frigates being larger, but the idea of them being able to maneuver quicker was essential when it came time for battle. The battles were within so many hundreds of yards of each other because the guns were all broadside. And that's where the damage came. Well, here we are, coming close. The Tigris, the Porcupine, the Caledonia, the Ohio, they were all built and launched in April of 1813. They came off from Lee's Run. Then in August, we launched the Lawrence and the Niagara. The Lawrence was named after Captain James Lawrence, who actually was the commander of the Chesapeake, which was in the Boston Harbor, blockading the harbor against the British. On a 1-to-1 battle between the British and the Chesapeake, the Shona was lost. Within the first 15 minutes, the British king took over the Chesapeake, and Captain Lawrence was mortally wounded in gun battle, not cannon, gun battle on the deck. He went down. As the crew took him down below, he shouted his last orders: "Don't give up the ship. Fight until she sinks." Those were his last orders, and that's what he's remembered for. In fact, when Oliver Hazard Perry was called in from Rhode Island to become the commander of the fleet, he heard of Lawrence's demise. They were friends, being together in another battle. It was he was his mentor. So in that time period, the Lawrence was named. And also, Commodore Perry had a blue flag constructed with that as his motto. Don't give up the ship. That would have been the motto that was continued through the U.S. Navy. It would have been hauled up and hoisted up on the flagship. The flagship Lawrence and the cutter, and also the Niagara. Those two sister ships had two masts. That's what made the brigs. They were 113 feet on the foremost mast and 118 feet on the main mast. They carried 15 sails, 8 of them square. The length was 118 feet long, 30 foot wide, and a draft. Now, on a brig of that size, the normal draft would have been 15 feet down. Because of the sandbar, they designed it with a 9-foot draft. In the berthing, or your berth, we had 5-foot clearance. But most of us were under 5 foot. Now, when it came time to launch, the Lawrence was first. The Lawrence was brought up, right up to that sandbar. It was shallow on that day of August the 4th. They had stripped her of her cannons. They took out her stone ballasts, not lead weighted. They used the lead to seal all the seams instead of oakum and cloth, because there wasn't any. So the lead was used to seal and watertight the ships. At that point, they took off everything that would be cumbersome in weight. They literally had a barge to float over that sandbar. They did two things. They first got ready to kedge the larger ships. Kedging is where they take out the anchor, float it out on another boat, and drop it, and have the rope line come back in to the capstan, and when they started turning, the boat was pulled toward the anchor. So that's how they started to get her across the sandbar. Then Noah Brown and his brother Adam, which were the designers of these ships, they devised a very ancient way of raising a float. They made camels, they were called. Two 90-foot by 10-foot square rectangulars, 6 foot deep. They had 4 total, 2 on each side. They filled them partially with water. They lined them up alongside, and in the sweep holes, which were the oars where they rowed, which would have been my job for getting in and out of ports, or when there was no wind, we extended those oars out as far as we can, and we became oarsmen. They used those sweeps, they attached them to the top of the camels. They pumped out the water, they sealed the camel tight, pumped out the water, and they raised her 3 foot. Those camels were used, and then they kedged across. And they kept kedging. Took 3 different times to get them across. By August 5th, she was out and onto the lake. On August 6th, the Niagara was up and out. August 6th, they were out on the lake. Now, there was also on the lake the British. They were coming from Long Point, and that's where their crew was working on their ships The Detroit was in timing with the building of the Lawrence and the Niagara. They kept bringing their search boats in right up to the point of near the harbor, watching as the structures were being built, watching as the maneuvers. For some odd reason, on those August days, they had gone back to Lake Point. They were probably manning their crews and getting their supplies needed. But at Long Point was where over 1,000 Indians that they took to help on the land maneuvers were living there, trying to feed their crew, and then 1,000 Indians, the supplies were starting to be rationed. They literally had to stop their supplies. The supply line ended, and that forced them to have to go further west on the end of the lake. Well, on the 17th of August, all the ships under Perry's command went west. They went to Bass Island. There's where Put-in Bay is, in Sandusky, Ohio. And there's where they ported. And that's where they did their training. That's where we had our training. Now, he was in hopes to have a much larger fleet of men. He was hoping for around 700. He was happy to have 300 with a minimum of 130 per large ship. And he had 8 other smaller ships to man. He was short. He did as much training as he could, but he was frustrated. He sent message to the Secretary of the Navy. He sent messages to Chauncey. Send men. We need men. The men that you've sent, and I won't say what else he said, were insufficient. But yet he trained them. What he did make note in some of his notations was that the black sailors, which were almost 40% of the full crew, were the best men he had. Staunch workers, brave, loyal, and not afraid to take on the gunning, to take on the heavy weights. A lot of the young black men were called, ready? Stock monkeys or powder monkeys, because they ran down into the lower, pulled up all the gunpowder, pulled up the cannonballs, and they manned it on a constant basis. In the training, they had to learn how to fire those cannons, and they got to the point where they would load, fire, clean out, reload, and fire again in a minute. Now, they did not do it all in succession. They did it in areas when they first trained. You at the bow, you at the stern, you in the center. They did training and they shot off out into the lake area until they got their maneuverability and understanding what area and how much they had to angle it. They had to watch for that back kick of the cannons. 10.5 cannon hitting you in the head because you were down too close, you wouldn't be on the ship any longer. They had to learn how to understand what rigging was contained to what sail, and there were certain codes that they had to learn. There was so much training, they did it within a month's time. On the 17th, Perry met with Colonel Harrison, the Colonel of the Army, in the Marine line. He got 1,000 Kentucky riflemen to come on board. They manned with their guns. They shot when they were close enough to shoot the enemy personally, not shooting at the sails or the structure. That's where the cannons were. On September 10th, at 11:45, Barclay, captain of the Detroit, and captain of his squad of 6 ships, came. They came close enough that they fired the first shot in order to try to get them out, because he wanted to get in to get his supplies to literally blast them out of the water. The first shot missed totally, but that set the timing for the battle. The timing for the battle finally happened. Finally, they were in line. Now, Perry gave the direction to be in alignment. One ship, small, off to the left. Then the Lawrence, the Caledonia, which is a middle-sized ship, the Niagara, and those to follow. The ones out on the outskirts were the ones to take care of the smaller ships and to be ahead of it, to making sure that they flagged what was going on. Realizing that we had men up here giving flag directions and also dodging any shots that were toward them. The Lawrence went full speed ahead. Perry said, "Okay, our last meal, all on deck, prepare for battle." And that's exactly what happened. He started shooting. Now, in order to get that first cannon out front to start shooting, you're limited. The broadside had all the guns. So you had to get into position to come along broadside in order to do your damage. The Lawrence, as she was going forward, anticipated that the Niagara would be behind. She wasn't. For 11:45 from that first shot to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Lawrence took a beating from the Detroit on one side, and then the Queen Charlotte coming on the other, because she would have been assigned to the Niagara, but the Niagara wasn't even in the firing arena. For some reason, she was back. Now, the excuse that was heard was that the southwest winds were not strong enough. But Perry and the other ships tacked back and forth to gain the wind, to get through. The Lawrence was totally annihilated. The Lawrence lost all of her guns from taking everything from the Detroit and from the Charlotte. Can you hit those lights? From that point, 21 men were killed and 61 were mortally wounded. In that case, that was 80 out of only 103 men on board. She was lost. She was a failure. At 2:30, Commodore Perry notices the Niagara coming up, finally catching wind and coming in to areas that could actually be potential battle. Perry grabbed me and 3 other oarsmen and his 13-year-old brother Alexander, and we got in the small dinghy that was tied to the back of the boat, and we rowed almost a half a mile to get to the Niagara, where we climbed on. Commander Elliott, who thought he was going to be in charge of the whole thing, which is a rumor that he disgruntledly held back and said, "Okay, Perry, you show me what you got if you think you're so tough." Not defending, he was actually contributing to the Niagara not being there and the Lawrence taking the fall. When the Lawrence literally went too slow. The Niagara gained something that was its flagship motto. Perry gave the flag to his younger brother and had him bring it on with us. As we rode fervently into the line, into the Niagara, we saw that there was a chance. Captain Elliott got put in charge of the Caledonia and hoisted up, "Don't give up the ship." That flag going up signified we are at battle and we're not giving up the ship. When the lieutenant commander of the Lawrence saw the flag go up, he lowered the state flag, and Barclay thought we were surrendering. They backed off. The Niagara came forth, got the sails, and what they did was they broke the T-line. When we say broke the T-line, here's the British. Here's the line of the United States. Here comes the Niagara, and the Niagara comes and breaks the T. Instructed to, on port side, to hit their smaller boats. The Detroit and the Queen Charlotte were here. Now the Detroit had lost her commander from firing from the Lawrence, and they lost part of their control of their masts. In turning to come around to go broadside, Queen Charlotte and the Detroit got tangled in with each other. Their rigs were actually entwined. They lost control of their ship. Perry's luck came through, turned broadside, and in 15 minutes totally annihilated the British line. 15 minutes. They ended up surrendering. They came back to the Lawrence. Barclay, who had already lost an arm in a previous battle, was now shot in the other arm. He came onto the Lawrence and surrendered. And that's when Commodore Perry, our hero, penned on the back of a letter envelope, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, 1 sloop." Now, in that was sent out. The battle stopped. We took possession of the British ships. We took possession of their crew, put them in prison holds. We didn't put them into our Navy. They were Brits. We didn't want that. We didn't need that. We now had a U.S. Navy that literally, practically won the War of 1812 on a lake. The Wilderness Fleet, as it was nicknamed, became the proud ship of the United States Navy. Now, it wasn't the last. The Lawrence returned, as in the rest of the crew. It was refurbished and went back out to Detroit to reclaim Fort Detroit. That was in 1814. In 1815, the war was declared complete with the treaty. The Lawrence now became of no use. They ported her, and also the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, in Little Bay. You may not know what Little Bay is. Mm-hmm. It was now named Misery Bay, because in that year, we stayed on ship. That year was probably the worst winter we've seen. We got dysentery. We lost our supplies. Our support from the Erie was minimal. Unfortunately, some of it was because of that 40 percentile of black sailors. Misery Bay was because of the men that died while they were ported, that died from malnutrition, that died from disease. And so they nicknamed it Misery Bay. They sunk the Charlotte, they sunk the Detroit, they scuttled the Lawrence. Now, the Lawrence stayed down there till 1836, but in 1825 they literally sold the sunken hull to someone that wanted to buy it and lift it to make it a merchant ship. When they discovered what the condition was, they sold it to somebody in Erie. And they raised it up to find out in 1836 that it wasn't worth the money that he paid for it, and he sunk it back down.
Yeah.
In 1876, the centennial of the United States, they brought up the hull of the Lawrence, cut her up into pieces and segments, took her on a train to Philadelphia, and repositioned her out flat to show the construction of that ship and the telling of the battle. That was in 1876, in December. In May, it ended. They were going to sell now parts of those pieces and put it into other ships, the money to go into other ships, and also to help the men in their prize money. In May, a fire took over the exhibit and the Lawrence was burnt down to ashes. Now the Niagara, she stayed and working and went to battle until 1820, where she was scuttled also. And you might know that story. Scuttled down into the deep mud of a shallow portion of the bay, thinking that that would hold up. Well, when they saw what happened in 1836 with the Lawrence, they figured because she was in bad shape already that she wasn't holding. But in 1913, when they brought her up to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the battle, the Lawrence was not worth saving. They saved her keel. They saved other parts to it. And then they rebuilt it. They rebuilt it and took it along the lakes with the Wolverine towing it, celebrating that 100th anniversary. After it was brought back, they put it out on State Street. Literally, money lost, totally neglected, deteriorated to the point where you could pick up by your hand pieces of the base crumbled and rotted. They tried to rebuild it, but because of the Depression and then World War II, and they didn't have any funding, finally now, 1986, a new ship, the existing Niagara, still has parts of the original in the spindles in her wardroom where the captain would stay. She is now in Maine, getting a $5 million refurbishment, and will be back for the centennial and also for Lawrence Park anniversary. Okay, that idea, July 2nd, she's to be in and being paraded in and out on the dock to celebrate the 4th of July and the centennial. So, I hope you gained some knowledge and also understood that Lawrence Park being named after Captain Lawrence, and the Lawrence being named after him and the part that it took place. And now in the logo, you have the Lawrence. In my docent's shirt, I have a copy of the Niagara, but it looks just identical to the Lawrence, a sister ship. So I always say, I'm representing two. I'm representing Lawrence Park, and I'm representing the Niagara. So, hope you have a great holiday.
Yeah.